Well, good morning and welcome to the Center for American Progress and our program today with the Chief of Naval Operations, U.S. Admiral John Richardson. I'm Rudy deLeon, a senior fellow here with our national security team, as well as Vikram Singh, our vice president, and Dr. Larry Korb, who is in the room somewhere, I know. Welcome to all of you for being here with us this Monday morning. I just want to briefly note that yesterday was 9/11, and I want to acknowledge everyone impacted on that day 15 years ago. People at work in New York and at the Pentagon, first responders, military and civilian personnel, and on a personal note, I want to acknowledge Lieutenant General Tim Maude, who was a professional colleague of mine, the personnel chief of the United States Army, with whom I worked closely when I was the Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness. General Maude made a huge contribution to our armed forces, and I want to acknowledge him today. Now, Admiral Richardson and Dr. Melanie Hart, who is the director of the China Studies program here at CAP, will shortly participate in a discussion on key issues in Asia Pacific and also the Arctic. Their discussion will include immediate issues that have been capturing attention in the public debate, such as the South China Sea, but also longer-term strategic trends and challenges as part of the U.S. rebalance to Asia that includes the implications of emerging technologies on the U.S. presence in the region, U.S. China mill-to-mill dialogue, and how the Navy is planning for an increasingly complicated Arctic region. Later in our program, we will invite our audience to participate with their own questions. This summer, the Center for American Progress, through its work with the Ford Foundation, brought an elite group of mid-career American and Chinese security experts together for a strategic dialogue on the U.S. China relations. This was the third iteration of our bilateral and bilingual program, which allows rising scholars to exchange ideas on some of the most challenging issues of the U.S. China relationship. Moreover, the Rising Scholars Dialogue enables the next generation of policymakers to bring fresh thinking to create consensus and build trust in ways that more senior policymakers often cannot. In June, while the South China Sea controversies dominated the press, our rising scholars met with high-level U.S. Pacific Command military leaders and other area experts. Forums like these are scarce, but with a complicated agenda growing between the United States and China, they have become even more critical. They have become the relationships built and insights gained on both sides provide tools and experiences designed to prevent miscommunication and misunderstanding. Available on the CAP website is the new report, Charting a New Course in the U.S.-China Relationship, Findings from the Center for American Progress, the 2016 U.S.-China Rising Scholars Strategic Dialogue by Dr. Melanie Hart. Any discussion of Asia Pacific in the 21st century needs to acknowledge the exceptional contribution of the United States Navy to the security and peaceful economic rise of the region. As Secretary of Defense Ash Carter acknowledged at the Shangri-La Conference, the United States will stand to uphold core principles: freedom of navigation and overflight, and the peaceful resolution of disputes through legal means and in accordance with international law. We want to recognize that that is also the mission of the men and women of the United States Navy through their service and their sacrifice in working every day to maintain and expand these principles. Leading today's Navy is the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson. He serves as a member of the Joint Chiefs, is a nuclear engineer by training, and a submariner by practice. He has received master's degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and the National War College. The CNO's job is one of the most complex in the Pentagon, from the Straits of Hormuz to the North Korean nuclear test to making sure the men and women of the Navy have the tools they need and are ready to do their job every day. So Admiral Richardson, very much we welcome you to the Center for American Progress for this exchange this morning, and thank you for spending time with us today. Admiral Richardson and Dr. Hart, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Admiral Richardson, for joining us this morning. I know people want to hear from you, so let's dive right in.
Okay, sounds good.
We have some specific questions about Asia and the Arctic, but before we go regional, could you first give us a picture of how do you view the key challenges facing the Navy today? How do regional challenges fit within the broader strategic framework that you're looking at?
Sure. Well, first, before I get started, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here and how grateful I am for everything that the Center for American Progress does, particularly to sharpen our thinking globally and in this very important region of the world. So I'll start off by saying that. With respect to our bigger challenges, our more global perspective, I see that our problem set is becoming more complex, both in sort of its character and its scale. In the terms of the character, the maritime domain, people have been going to sea for thousands of years, but it is a tremendously quickening pace. There's a lot of changing dynamics in the maritime domain. Just ocean traffic has increased by a factor of 4 in the past 25 years. The technology has given rise to access to resources on the ocean floor. The infrastructure on the ocean floor has grown tremendously in terms of undersea cables and apparatus to get at those resources. We'll talk probably, I'm sure, on the Arctic, which is receding and opening up access to continental shelves and transit routes that weren't available before. And so very, very rapidly changing pace in the ocean maritime domain. As well, we see that since we were last sort of in a peer-to-peer competition being contested for maritime superiority about 25 years ago, the information domain is on us in a big way, quickening and changing the character of what everybody does, including us in the Navy. And then finally, there is this introduction of technology, right? Not only in information technologies, but that could include, genetic engineering, additive manufacturing, artificial intelligence, some real game-changing technologies. So the character of the competition, if you will, is changing. And then, of course, there are the competitors that are changing as well. And so we really sort of align ourselves with the kind of 4+1, if you will, the sort of China and Russia in one group, Iran, North Korea in another group, and then this pervasive and resilient counterterrorism fight that we've been in. And so that's our problem set as we define it right now. The character and the competitors have changed since the last time we were really in a peer-to-peer competition.
You mentioned China as a key competitor. A lot of people are focusing attention on maritime issues in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. China's actions in current maritime disputes have been what many would call aggressive and destabilizing. And China scholars here in the U.S. are talking about two different challenges that we see with recent Chinese actions. On the one hand, you have the near-term issue of trying to make sure that disputes are resolved peacefully and allies aren't trampled. And secondly, you have what some see as a potential longer-term challenge, which is this question of whether China is aiming to establish some kind of sphere of influence in the region that would push the U.S. Navy out. And some of my Chinese friends say that's absolutely not the case. Some of my American friends are concerned that it is. So when you look at maritime disputes, how do you, as the Chief of Naval Operations, how are you looking at these shorter and longer-term challenges, and what do you see as the Navy's metric of success on that issue?
Well, I think, to use sort of a Facebook term, it's complicated, right? Just as you outlined. There are all of those dynamics happening simultaneously as we move forward. And so as I aim to structure our relationship with our counterparts in the People's Liberation Army Navy, it's exactly along those lines. First and foremost, I think that we've got to continue to engage. I'm an advocate for engagement, thoughtful engagement. And then, as you said, there are certainly areas where we have common interests and our behaviors are aligning to support those common interests. So, for instance, this last summer, I went out and visited the Rim of the Pacific exercise. It's the largest maritime exercise in the world. 26 nations participating, hundreds of ships, and tens of thousands of people participating, including the Chinese Navy. And so in these types of engagements, we all come together to advocate for all of those things that you mentioned: freedom of navigation, access really is the word, access to markets, access to ports, access to sea lanes. On the other hand, there are these destabilizing, provocative types of behaviors in the South China Sea, areas where we don't necessarily agree. And in those areas, we'll conduct the relationship such that we can continue to move towards some kind of a compromise, a resolution, and as we move there, do everything we can to minimize the risk involved in the relationship as we work these things out. And so again, this last summer I had the chance to visit the Carrier Strike Group, the John C. Stennis Strike Group, on station there in the South China Sea. I wanted to get a sense of how that was going, and they were there, and they were, of course, surrounded by several ships from the Chinese Navy who were doing their business. Some of them were assigned to observe the Stennis Strike Group, and there were dozens of encounters with our counterparts there, and each one of those encounters, though, by and large, performed according to a rule set that had been established by this CUES effort, Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea. And so everybody comes up on the radio, they establish, the rules for passage, and then they execute. And so in this way, my hope is that we'll continue to have access to the South China Sea. We're there now, and we're going to remain there, that we will advocate and enhance those areas where we have common interests, and then we'll work towards resolution where we have differences in a way that minimizes the chance of a miscalculation that could go quickly from a tactical type of a thing up to a strategic thing.
At a personal level, how do you handle the fact that U.S. China relations can go very well with an exercise like RIMPAC, where the two navies are working together, but things can also go quite more contentiously on some issues? How do you deal with your PLA Navy counterparts in a situation where you're trying to think about cooperation, but at the same time you're, I probably shouldn't use the word drawing red lines, since that's a complicated term, but you're trying to at least establish some clear understanding about what the U.S. is and is not willing to accept?
Well, I thank you for pointing out the importance of personal relationships, because the other thing I did this last summer, it's a busy summer now that I mention it, but I had a chance to visit my counterpart, Admiral Wu Shengli, the head of the Chinese Navy, and that's probably the fifth time that we've had a chance to converse directly just in my year as the Chief of Naval Operations. And these personal relationships, I think, are vital as part of moving the relationship forward in useful ways. And so one of those conversations, for instance, happened right in the kind of near aftermath of one of our freedom of navigation exercises, where we sent a ship to contest excessive maritime claims in the South China Sea. These relationships, I think, are extremely important. The two leaders can get things done, they can come to an understanding, and then exercise their authorities and responsibilities through the whole force to make sure that everybody gets the word, if you will. But I think that they're only productive if they're also very honest. And so in my last conversation with my counterpart, we were both very honest, very frank in terms of, hey, these sorts of things would be very helpful in terms of moving the relationship forward in profitable and mutually beneficial ways. These sorts of behaviors would be completely not helpful in terms of moving that relationship down the road. And so there again, minimizing uncertainty, minimizing risk of miscalculation by sort of stating in advance that, hey, you do these sorts of things, that would be very good. These sorts of things, that's going to be troublesome.
And a lot of attention is on China these days, but Japan is a critical U.S. ally in the region, and the U.S. and Japan work together on a lot of common challenges. There's also the issue of the East China Sea, which some say is more dangerous than the South China Sea. How do Japan and other players fit in with naval strategy in the region?
No, it's exactly as you say. It is a regional security challenge, right? And so it would be incorrect for anybody to understand this as a solely bilateral type of an issue. And so this part of the world is growing so rapidly. The economies of the Indo-Asia region driving the global economy. And so there's a lot of nations who have a stake in how this comes out. A lot of those in the news lately. And so as we work to not only enhance our bilateral relationship, we do so mindful that it's the real goal is a regional security architecture that would be, I think, that would allow all of the nations that are invested in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific to have access to those types of markets that are going to lead to their continued prosperity. And so we work, of course, very closely with Japan, but also many others of our traditional allies in the region. And then we're finding that there are some emerging allies as well. And so, Vietnam, an ally that's a relationship that's growing. I would say we're really making big strides in our relationship with India on a Navy-to-Navy and a nation-to-nation basis. And so there's a regional dynamic to this as well, as you point out.
And I know as Chief of Naval Operations, you can't only focus on current challenges. You have to also look to the future. And that's one area where the Arctic is really coming into play. The Arctic, as a region, is also impacting the rest of the globe because it's melting and contributing to sea level rise. Scientists expect that with current warming rates, the Greenland ice sheet cannot be stopped. The melting is almost certain. And so that will cause flooding of naval installations around the world, including many U.S. naval installations. We're expecting rising seas impacting the U.S. and other nations. We're expecting to see new sea lanes opening up in the Arctic, so we'll have new transport, new other nations like Russia and China perhaps moving in, more resource extraction in the region. How is the Navy looking at the Arctic as a next phase challenge, both handling issues within that region and the way it's going to impact the rest of the world?
Well, it's certainly going to impact the rest of the world. And so as we start to look at just the physics of the melting Arctic and not only the rising sea level, but also changes in ocean currents, and it is a big environmental impact that we'll see here that'll just accelerate some of the other dimensions of climate change, and so that's got a strategic element to it. With respect to the kind of the Navy component of that, as you pointed out, right now, the Arctic is as small as it's been in my career. I think it's as small as it's been since we started taking sort of, precise measurements of the size of the Arctic ice cap. And that's only going to continue, as you point out. So now sea lanes are open for, twice, 3 times as long as they have been in the past, and may be permanently open as the Arctic continues to shrink. If you think about the strategic implications of that, what was a very geostrategic choke point now is not, because you don't have to go through the Straits of Malacca, for instance. You can go over and take a northern route to get access to those same markets. And so these are both commercial and security types of dynamics that'll change, and we've got to be responsive to that. As you point out, there will also be continental shelves that will be exposed, the resources and everything that come with that. I think that as these emerging things open up, it strikes me that we need to be even stronger advocates for a rule set, whether it's UNCLOS or that in combination with others, that will govern how we manage this opening opportunity or opening challenge. And without coming to consensus on a rule set and advocating for that through the same measures, presence and all those things that visibly show that we support those things, it's going to be much more chaotic than it needs to be. And so it's in some ways it's new, and it's in many ways it's consistent with the importance of these peaceful rules that allow peaceful resolution to these types of challenges.
It seems there could be an interesting parallel between the South China Sea questions about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the Arctic, the opening Arctic issues. And we've seen that it's important for the U.S. to have a presence in the South China Sea. It's harder to have a presence in the Arctic because that requires icebreakers.
Right.
We've seen that when we have oil spills in the Arctic, it's very hard to get access for environmental reasons. And I imagine it will also be hard to get access for national security reasons. Do you feel that the U.S. Navy is equipped to have the presence that we need to have in the Arctic now?
Well, we've got a sort of a persistent presence in the Arctic. Mostly it's been sort of undersea. So, our submarine force has done an exercise in the Arctic every other year where we surface one or more submarines through the ice. We set up an ice camp up there. And, we do a number of research projects, both, some security related and others, not, right, environmentally related. Those have been very fruitful in terms of improving our understanding of how to operate in the Arctic. We've also got aircraft and those sorts of things, and so it's primarily been limited to that. It's a difficult place to operate, right? It's really cold up there, and then communications and everything else become difficult. It brings its own navigation. There's some unique challenges to operating up there. But I'll tell you, as you start to address those 4+1 challenges that we talked about at the opening, to date, it's been, a sort of a resource-constrained approach, I would say. And so while we don't want to ever lose our connection with the Arctic, we're going to keep that. In fact, another thing we did this last year was exercise cold response with the Marine Corps going up into Norway and just doing cold weather types of operations so that we again, maintain that sense of familiarity. It's going to be kind of on a resource-constrained basis. We'll get up there as often as we can, but the demands on the Navy in those other areas is acute and is already kind of stretching the Navy that we have. Icebreakers, working very closely with the Coast Guard, trying to come to a memorandum of understanding in terms of how to regenerate the next generation of icebreakers. That's been a Coast Guard mission set, and we're ready to support them in any way that we can.
Thank you. I know we have people here who would like to pose some questions. So I think the CAP team can go around with the microphone. Yep, here he comes. Maybe right here in the first row.
Hey,
And you
Justin
should state your name, please, and who you're with.
Justin Doubleday with Inside Defense. I just wanted to ask you about the changes the Navy just introduced to its littoral combat ship program. You're now changing a number of signature elements of that program, from the crewing model to the mission modules element to the maintenance. Can you explain kind of why those changes are necessary now and how it's going to kind of set the right course for that program?
Not particularly, Indo-Asia Pacific question, but I'll answer it. And I thought Admiral Roden did a terrific job answering all those questions last week with his media roundtable. But as with any new class of ship, the littoral combat ship being one of the recent ones, you have this sort of vision for how the class will be conceptualized and built and deployed and how it will perform. And then you have the reality of how it comes to life. And so I think that the only mistake you can make is to be too slavishly focused on your original vision when the data from the actual deployments could teach you something. And so as we deploy that ship, we're learning lessons in just about every area. The engineering, right? We've learned a lot about the engineering of the ship, and Admiral Moore, the head of Naval Sea Systems Command, is responding to those with his team of engineers. We're learning lessons from a personnel standpoint and the crewing type of rotation. And Admiral Roden, as the head of the Surface Force, is responding to those. We're looking for continuing always to learn to see how we can get more usefulness out of this class of ship, whether that's a different forward deployment model. And then everywhere we can in the Navy, really advocating for the simplest possible structure that will get the job done. And so we're finding ways to simplify, I suppose, the littoral combat ship program that would allow us to at least achieve the aims of the program, maybe even improve on its usefulness while we simplify the program as well. So we're really just sort of adjusting to the data that we get, learning as we go forward, and we think that at the end we hope to have not only a more capable littoral combat ship fleet contributing to the larger fleet, but also a simpler concept in terms of operating it.
Yep, right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency. Today, China and Russia started a joint military exercise in the South China Sea. This is an 8-day military joint exercise. Are you concerned that the U.S. and China and Russia are strengthening the cooperation in the South China Sea to offset the U.S. influence in that areas? Is it possible in the future there will be a military exercise between U.S. and China in the South China Sea or East China Sea? Thank you.
Well, with respect to military exercises with the U.S. and China, RIMPAC is an example of our willingness to do those sorts of things. Whether that concept goes further, we're open to that as part of that type of those types of activities would be in that category of sort of mutually beneficial types of behaviors. And so we'll just sort of leave that option open and see what happens. With respect to the participation of Russia, as we discussed up here, and Melanie pointed it out, it is a regional security dynamic, and so we'll just have to be responsive to what emerges. And some of that dynamic will be more concerning than others, but we'll just have to watch it and make sure that we are responsive to what may come.
We had another question in the second row, center.
Will Amatruda, a number of years ago, there was quite a bit of coverage in the press about piracy in the Gulf of Aden, Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea area, and the seizure of merchant ships for ransom. And I hadn't seen a story like that for quite a while. Does that mean the problem has been solved? And what has been the Navy's role in doing that?
Oh, well, that's a great question because it highlights, I think, the benefits of certain approaches. And I would say that the approach to piracy in that part of the world, the Gulf of Aden, off the Horn of Africa, has truly been sort of a multinational approach. And so there are a number of task forces, one with the European Union, one with the Fifth Fleet, Central Command, both multinational. I think 31 nations in the multinational task force that is hosted there in Bahrain. And it has been that multinational approach that has really made it a much less severe problem. In fact, I think it's been some time since we've had a ship taken hostage there. When, as you point out, not too long ago, we were seeing that being a very regular news story. And so this idea that, particularly for issues like piracy, which is one of those issues that can unite a lot of nations, right? I mean, who can argue that we want to eliminate piracy on the high seas? It's a unifying force, if you will. Plus, in many cases, it doesn't take exquisite capability to combat a threat like piracy, on the high seas. And so not only are a lot of nations sort of united in the aims, but they can come and participate meaningfully in the coalition to eliminate that threat. And so that's sort of what's happened in that part of the world. Now, you asked if it's solved. I would have to say no, because it's sort of popping up in other parts of the world. The Gulf of Guinea is an area where we're seeing increasing activity. Down in the area, kind of in the South China Sea area around the Philippines, we're seeing increasing types of piracy activity. And so it's something that but I think maybe a similar type of an approach where we fill the security vacuum with a multinational approach, again, a nice unifying theme in those other parts of the world, brings nations together at sea in very meaningful ways, allows us to operate together. You have to do real coordination, real operations, and so it's a great mission to unify around. Similar missions are humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and safety, submarine safety for those nations that have a submarine force or are standing up a submarine force. And so, that mission is just a nice example of ways that we can really bring multinational coalitions together in a regional security architecture framework to make meaningful progress against a real threat. And then, of course, we have to work in not only a joint, but I think a multinational and a multi-agency, interagency approach, because the real root causes of piracy are, of course, not at sea. That's the symptom of a problem on shore that will need to be addressed to really eradicate the root cause. So it's really, kind of a nice mission to bring a lot of people together to work in meaningful ways and make good progress.
Megan Eckstein with U.S. Naval Institute News. Going back to your comments on the Arctic region and being resource constrained today, you have several, in the near to midterm, several new ship classes coming out, LXR, Ohio Replacement, the future surface combatant family. And I was just wondering if there's any thought given to putting capabilities on those ship classes to allow them to go into the Arctic in the future if needed, or if money's so tight right now that you might not be able to do the research and development and planning needed to do that down the road.
I think you raise a good point, Megan, that as we address the sort of the future surface combatants in particular, we really need to be as broad in our thinking as possible. And so as I think about just building this ship, some aspects or characteristics of that new generation of surface ships, those characteristics will be with it for the life of the ship, right? So propulsion, for instance, that's a difficult thing to change out after you design it in and build it. In fact, the energy generation scheme for the ship is something that generally stays with the ship for its lifetime. There may be some quieting aspects, which for certain types of ship is very important. So there's other sort of life of the ship type things. But if it's a lesson that we've learned, is that to the biggest extent possible, we want to make the rest of the ship modular and modernizable, if you will, if I can coin a new word. And so this will allow, the Navy and that class of ship to sort of take advantage and ride the technology curve into the future. And so as, new capabilities come to bear, miniaturization happens, et cetera, you can just build more capability into that ship going forward. And so this idea, one of the things you want to design in is sort of, as much power, as much cooling, as much weight and space. You want to get the center of gravity right to allow the ship to be able to modernize into the future. That would, of course, include, just in response to your thoughtful question, hey, the Arctic is going to be a different type of a theater in the future. And if we neglect the fact that we're going to be operating in the Arctic as we design this new class of ship, that's just sort of narrow thinking on our part. And so now the question of icebreakers is interesting, because there's probably some features of icebreakers that are kind of those life of the ship types of issues, the hull structure and strengthening that has to be put in place to be able to do the icebreaking mission. But there's an awful lot that also is sort of modular, the communications and the rest of it. So I think we'll have to make sure that we consider that going forward as much as possible.
The lady on the third row.
Hi, Hope Suck with military.com. You talked a little bit about your hopes for continued encounters with Chinese ships in the South China Sea. I wanted to ask about recent encounters with Iranian vessels. And there have been flares, there have been warning shots fired. What is the U.S. Navy prepared to do if these encounters continue to intensify? And what are the parameters limiting the way that they can respond?
Well, there's really nothing that limits the way that they can respond. So the commanders that are there are very well led, and I've got to just take the opportunity to say that in some super dynamic situations, and you've seen some of these unfold on in video, right? You're there, and you can see it. The decisions are often made in
extremely short periods of time. But we always strive to make sure that our commanders have the situational awareness and the capability and the rules of engagement that they need to manage those situations. It advocates, or it's a great demonstration of something that I advocate for, which is the need to continue to develop a sort of a decentralized approach towards operations, right? These things happen on a time scale that really doesn't allow those commanders to, sort of phone home for permission and then respond. They've got to know what their commander's guidance is. They've got to be given the freedom to act, to take advantage of fleeting opportunities, and also to make sure that they can respond to these very fast-moving opportunities. And so, from the standpoint of, is our Navy prepared to respond? I'd say yes in every respect. Now, so what about these? How should we think about them? These are some of these, I would say, sort of, potentially destabilizing things where, a tactical miscalculation, the closer and closer you get for those sorts of things, the margin for error gets smaller, and you just, the human error can play a bigger and bigger role. So, I think it's very important that we eliminate this sort of activity where we can. There's nothing good can come from it, and so that would be my major message. Also advocates for the power of sort of a leader-to-leader dialogue, and so we're working to sort of think our way through, what are the possibilities there, both with the Iranians and also, I would say, with the Russians who have exhibited this behavior as well, so that we can get up on the line and kind of have a conversation about whether this would be helpful or hurtful. This is not in the helpful category, right? This is something that can only lead to a miscalculation, and we've had those in before. We've got the practices to prevent incidents at sea with the Russians. That is a living agreement, in place today, and so it's discussed annually with the Russians and kept relevant each time. And every time we get together, we talk through these sorts of close encounters, and again, stressing that they're not helpful. I mentioned this code for unplanned encounters at sea with the Chinese, which has been very, very useful. And in fact, the vast majority of interactions with the Chinese Navy have been completely consistent with those. In fact, when I visited China, I went and I had a chance to visit their aircraft carrier, and they had a number of their officers in this room where we had a conversation. And I asked for sort of show of hands, who in that room, at sea, has had a chance to encounter a U.S. warship? And there were a lot of hands that went up. So this is happening at sea, but they have this rule set that they abide by, both teams, and that's been very useful. Getting some kind of a rule set like that, particularly with the Iranians, would also be helpful, so that we can kind of have these frameworks for behavior that would guide us more towards useful types of encounters at sea, rather than these close aboard types of demonstrations that really don't have any positive benefit.
Back toward the maybe center, fourth row. Yep.
Hi, Admiral. Mark Sellinger, Defense Daily. Do you foresee any changes in naval missile defense in the Asia-Pacific region, especially in light of North Korea's recent activities? Some missile defense advocates have been advocating that the Aegis Ashore test site be operationalized, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and so am I interested in enhancing our capability in missile defense? The answer is yes. And so it's a big part of our portfolio going forward to continue to enhance that, mostly because that's a tremendous challenge.
in terms of naval warfare going forward. And so we've got to be mindful of that and responsive to it. And the weapons are becoming very, very energetic these days. And so really the idea of doing everything you can to bring technology and CONOPS to bear to prevent being hit by one of those weapons is a big part of our portfolio going forward. Now the details of that, first, they're, as you can imagine, they're classified. And then it's got to be done with an eye towards what is technically helpful, right? I mean, it's a highly technical approach, and so how any specific capability, either in location or technology, fits into that has got to be done kind of from a systems perspective. But we're exploring all of the above.
Gentleman towards back.
Thank you very much. Admiral, I have a question regarding perhaps the Taiwan Straits as much as the East and South China Seas. And that is, China is said to have developed a anti-access area denial kind of strategy and with capabilities to go with it. Are you satisfied that with the role that the Navy can play in resisting that or overcoming that or dealing with that in ways you would regard as satisfactory?
Well, it's a great question. And so this anti-access area denial phrase, I'm having some fun with that phrase this summer, in fact, because it really describes sort of an aspiration rather than any kind of a strategy, right? And if you just go, a big fan, if you want a new idea, read an old book. This idea of access and denial is the dynamic of warfare. And so you can go back to the very beginnings Agincourt with the archers and, just moving forward from there. It's been a dynamic of how this warfare business is done. What has really come to bear, though, is that there is this near ubiquitous ability to detect things further and further away, right? So now the ISR problem has been really transformed by the introduction of certain technologies. And then you've got these precision technologies with GPS and other types of things that allow you to take a weapon and reach out further and further with greater precision against a target that you can sense further and further away. And so this is the next step, I guess, in that dynamic. But it remains sort of the aspiration, right? I sort of just, I like the discussions that start with, hey, okay, we've got this particular missile system at this point, that's where the launcher is, and it's got, 500-mile range. So you draw this circle of a 500-mile radius, and then everything inside that circle is, red, as if you cross into that circle, and with 100% probability you're eliminated. It's just a no-go zone. And the truth of the matter is much more complicated than that. While it's easier to detect things, at distance, it's still difficult. And if you just think about the whole sequence of events that has to happen, in perfect synchrony to execute that mission, there's ways to sort of deconstruct that chain of events all the way through. And so I think that, again, it's kind of a systems of systems approach to analyze that entire chain of events, do what you can to, sort of manipulate it, disrupt it, and then that's just the defensive posture. Then there is, what are you going to do with that access once you gain it? And so we're looking at creative, things to do with that as well. And so this anti-access area denial, A2AD, is something that we've got to be careful isn't some kind of a panacea or a system that we have no answers to. We have a number of answers to these things. It's much more difficult than the solid red, circles, and we'll just continue to analyze it as it goes. This dynamical change, right? It'll get even more ubiquitous. I think we're within, a single-digit number of years of being able to access pretty much real-time video of any place in the world you want on demand, right? I mean, there's just the types of systems that are going up into space right now. Now, they may not be able to read your driver's license from space, but they can, that may not be what it takes, right? They can provide you an awful lot of information. You couple that with some, analytic software, and you've got a system that's going to be a lot more robust than even the current system is. And so we've got to be sensitive to your point about looking forward, of anticipating what that means for the way we gain awareness and make decisions.
If I could close out with one more China question.
Okay.
A couple of times you mentioned regional security architecture in the Asia Pacific. In the way you vision regional security architecture, is there a place for China within that?
I think that absolutely. I mean, I think that any regional security architecture in the Indo-Pacific that excludes China is one that we just have to go back and readdress. To just sort of pretend that China's not going to be there is, I think, is just unrealistic. I think it must include China.
And not just, a lot of my Chinese friends say the architecture is anti-China, but you're envisioning that China could play a more partnership role at some point.
I mean, China is this tremendous growing nation, and as nations grow, we shouldn't be surprised that China is moving to become global, to continue to prosper. And part of that global move is going to be a move to the sea, right? I mean, the global economy, 90% of the global goods still travel by sea. China is a major player in that global economy. It's no surprise that they should have interests in the maritime domain, not only for economic reasons, but then right behind that is security reasons. And so we shouldn't be surprised by that. And a future architecture, both economic and security, it's going to have to include the Chinese, I think.
Well, on behalf of the Center for American Progress, thank you for everything you're doing
Melanie,
for
thank
our
you very
nation.
much.
And thank you for taking a break from that to spend an hour talking with us today. Really appreciate your candid answers and forward-looking thinking, and thank you.
Thanks very much.